Our guest today is Matt Beienburg with the Goldwater Institute. I had the privilege of meeting him a while back and decided at that point I wanted to hear his voice and let you hear his voice on this podcast that we are launching today. So the Goldwater Institute, one of its main statements when you go to the website is empowering all Americans to live freer, happier lives. Well, that's a great positive statement and one that probably all of us would like to see them be successful in. But three areas of focus that I noticed there specifically: ensuring school choice for every child, fighting in courtrooms across the country, and passing laws in states across the nation. So, Matt, we are delighted to have you with us today in the studio for this episode of the State of Education podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. So to get started, please tell us a little bit more about yourself so our audience will know who they're listening to. And then from there, you can kind of go into how you became involved with the Goldwater Institute and really what you do right now to make a difference for educational freedom in America's families.
Sure. So again, Matt Beienburg, I'm the Director of Education Policy here at the Goldwater Institute, native of Arizona, so glad to be back here in Phoenix where we're based. We're focused on, as you mentioned, Goldwater Institute as an institute is focused on free market principles, advancing those throughout the country, kind of as you said, both legislatively and through litigation as necessary. So my focus, obviously, in education, that means both K-12 and the universities. And so, not only as a parent, but as somebody who's interested in politics and policy, it's a great area to be able to help, promote reform and help solve a lot of these issues that are facing, the students and the country as a whole. So my background a little bit, I had worked in the state legislative budget office, looking at the actual finances, the nuts and bolts, and all the dollar signs behind a lot of the education policies, since that's so much of what things kind of come down to. At the end of the day, what matters is educating kids, but so much of the conversation, the debate tends to focus on, are we spending enough? We're not spending enough. Are we spending it in the right ways? And so to have an understanding of that, I think is really kind of important in a lot of these conversations, especially, and I think we'll talk, sort of about school choice and then making sure that those dollars are able to follow the students. And so having an ability to kind of engage with that, I think, is critical for a lot of these conversations. So that's kind of our area of focus, looking at school choice, things like ESAs, but also pushing back on sort of indoctrination in the classroom, providing transparency for parents and promoting civic education for students. So trying to take all that and push in a way that aligns with the values of parents and families and make sure that students are the priority.
Excellent. Well, sounds like we got a lot to talk about. So, everybody understands that COVID brought the classroom right into the living room, and now parents are wanting change in their schools. What are the biggest issues at stake for our children and their families? I'm coming at this from two perspectives. For our children and their families, as well as for schools and the nation. So kind of focus with the family and the individual, and then the organization, the institute, and particularly then, the future of our country.
Yeah, and I think you framed that in a great way, which is so many, especially people on the left, tend to focus on the schools as if they are the end, product of what we're trying to do, whereas the schools are there to serve the students and the families, right? And so I think the fact that you kind of asked about that is what's key. And, it comes down to the fact that we need to make sure that that's what's happening. I mean, that's literally the fundamental issue at play, is to make sure our education system is serving and meeting the needs of students. And as you alluded to during COVID, we saw that completely inverted, where students were essentially treated as an afterthought. The schools shut down to in-person learning. We saw governors like DeSantis and others who took flack from the left to say that you're not prioritizing this institution, you're jeopardizing, going against the experts and what they're saying. And yet we found out that, the data has since vindicated that, look, it was correct that those students should have been in class and learning. And so I think that it's important. We've seen teachers unions and a lot of those activist groups who have divorced really the emphasis of education from students' needs. And so I think, to your question, the most important thing is to say, how can we meet the academic needs of our students, right? At the core, the purpose of our schools is to provide academic enrichment for our students. And that obviously encompasses not only, English, math, science, all those critical courses in civics, but then also making sure and to ensure that the students are progressing, well-rounded character. That doesn't mean a bunch of progressive ideology pushed in there, but making sure that the students are able to grow and be civically minded citizens who have an appreciation of the Constitution and our system here. And unfortunately, we've seen so much, again, that tends to leave that behind. And so I think that that's something that we need to make sure is always priority number one, that we're pushing, opportunities for students first. And obviously we've seen, recently the data that came out from the NAEP scores, which is the nation's report card. Essentially, the U.S. Department of Education does a survey, confirmed, students' academic trajectories took a huge hit in the wake of COVID and all this distance learning. So I think restoring that, ensuring that students are actually prioritized is number one. And looking at the schools in the system, it's to ensure that there is flexibility in the options that are available, right? We historically have had this issue of, well, you've got school districts, they're established there. And really, Arizona and other states have shown we have almost a quarter of our public schools students are now in charter schools, right? And so these are highly functioning, high-performing schools of choice that have different emphases. Some may be on classical education, some may be on STEM, and allow a kind of vibrant mix of different schooling options, and to ensure that these same sort of opportunities exist throughout the country, because unfortunately there are a lot of states with hardly a handful of such operators, and so the only schools you have are whatever happens to be your local district offering.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And how do these decisions, I mean, it seems like we would know this just intrinsically, but the whole idea of focusing with our kids and our families, but what about the systems and schools? And you mentioned different options here, but a lot of people are concerned, okay, so if you create choice, it's going to destroy our school systems. And, that's a question I'd like you to dig into for just a moment. The other side of that is, how important is what's going on in education right now to the future of our country?
Sure. Well, to your first point, the question of, does having opportunity, is that going to somehow sabotage the public school system? Is that going to, hurt that? We've actually seen the Stanford Opportunity Project. They've actually gone through there and, again, looked at some of this national data over the past about 20 years to see, well, how are students doing in different learning environments, in different districts, in different states? They actually found that Maricopa County, which is the county that Phoenix is in, large urban county, had essentially the highest growth, particularly for low-income students, anywhere in the country, right? And so what we're seeing is Phoenix, which is one of these hubs of school choice, actually tends to promote better outcomes. And it's not, the rationale for that's not all that surprising, right? If there are more options, it says, if you're a school provider, kids don't have to go to you unless you are performing, right? So if you're offering a good product, you're offering good education, students come to you, the school gets that funding. If not, they're going to go somewhere else. Whereas if you're a monopoly and you're the only game in town, you have no incentive to provide a better education, right? You have no incentive to bring in stronger leadership, no incentive to make sure your teachers are support, right? All of these things don't exist if there's a single player. And that's where I think that, again, Arizona is a model to say, this is a win-win, right? This provides opportunity for students, provides flexibility, but also at the same time improves the overall health and integrity of the education system. Mm-hmm. And then to your second question, I think it's foundationally important to the future of the country, right? I mean, you have the quotes from Reagan and others, right? Freedom only being a generation away. We have to make sure that the next generation is actually taught, again, not only the core of math and science, which and English and reading and all these different topics, to ensure that they have an appreciation for our founding principles, which is something that I think our public school system has largely failed to do. Again, the data there shows it's about 1 in 5 students who are proficient in things like civics and U.S. history, right? We are failing our kids in a lot of these ways. And I think it's, again, essential that we begin to prioritize these things again.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And, it is interesting with the laws that were passed in Arizona here just this year. Arizona right now has the most, I'm going to use a word that the left uses all the time, the most progressive school freedom, education freedom laws that any state has right now. Tell us about that process.
Sure. So Arizona, about 10 years ago, actually, this was a Goldwater policy that we helped promote, the idea of education savings accounts or ESAs, right, and essentially says, instead of, again, making the focus on a school or an institution, the focus is going to be on the student. And so instead of having the state of, Arizona or any other state spend what it's going to on you as a public school student, which in Arizona, just, for reference, about $13,000 per public school student each year. So instead of taxpayers spending that $13,000 to send a student to a public school, if the family thinks that maybe their student would fit in better somewhere else, the state says, we're going to give you a portion of what we otherwise would have spent sending you to that public school. We're going to put it into an account just for your student. And now you can use that for any kind of educational purpose, whether that's tutoring, whether that's textbooks, whether that's private school tuition, special needs therapies, whatever educational use is going to best serve your student. Now you as the parent and the family can direct it there. And so this program started in Arizona back in 2011, 2012, was open just to a subset of students in the state. So students with special needs. It was expanded to include kids from military backgrounds or the foster care system, but it was still only open to about 1 in 4 students. And so this past legislative session, Representative Ben Toma from the House of Representatives here in Arizona and Governor Ducey and the folks in the legislature and here in the Capitol essentially put forward a plan and got enacted a universal expansion of this ESA program, which says every student in the state, regardless of your income, regardless of your background, doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter anything about you fitting checking one box or otherwise, you as a student, just like you have a right to go to a public school, now have a right to, if you would prefer, to opt into this ESA program. And so that says we have now made school choice universal for Arizona students. Everybody qualifies if you're a K through 12 student, and you get to choose what's going to best work for your students. So that's in addition to, again, we've got a robust charter school program. We've got, ESAs serve students who want to do at-home education, who want to go to a private school, who want to do micro schools, pods, all these things. So Arizona has, again, kind of made itself, like you said, a very forward thinking in terms of being a laboratory of opportunity for these students.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. And so, there's a lot of language that's been used around school choice. It was always called school choice. And, some of us are trying to get away from that language because it's had successes and failures through the years. And, the tendency to think school choice, it means, okay, I get to choose what school I'm going to put my child in, with the concept that the funding is going to follow the institution anyway. And so, that's kind of been the classic thing where wherever the parent decides to put their child, that's where the funding goes to the institution. But I think with the shift that's going on now in policy formation, it's where the money follows the student, not the institution. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And as you said, we've kind of seen different versions of this throughout times where you may have the funding that follows a student to a certain school district or maybe to a charter school. Something like the ESA says it's going to the student and they now can use it. If they, again, want to put part of that toward textbooks or part of it toward tuition, they get to it. Those funds exist for the student. We've already seen things like health savings accounts. A lot of these policy ideas that have already existed and been fairly successful now applied to education to exactly as you said. This is individualizing it for the student. It's not about a particular institution or particular, brick and mortar facility.
Okay, that's great. Well, certainly we've seen lots of momentum in the last couple of years, particularly in this area. Numbers of states are involving this new kind of process. West Virginia, recently passed some pretty expansive for them, very significant changes. And then, of course, with the signing that you guys did just this past year, you guys kind of took the lead again in that whole situation. But, this is being promoted now across the country, many, many states. I am in Virginia, and I know that's a big focus for 2023, to start making progress toward these education savings accounts, really where the funding follows the student. And that gives more say to the parent. We're excited about it because we believe that more choice creates competition. And when we see competition, it's a basic free market enterprise kind of concept. When people have choice, bottom line is the providers they have to compete for the market. They have to have a superior product. They have to have a lower price, various qualifiers that make the customer go to them, where when it's a total monopoly, there's no initiative whatsoever to bring any real changes. That's how here in Virginia and Loudoun County, in the last year or so, we heard people saying, that the parents are just, the troublemakers, and that really started a major movement here in Virginia, as most people know that. So you are based in Arizona, but you have a nationwide thrust, a nationwide impact that you're working. So what specific actions are you taking right now to advance the concepts that you've gotten through there in Arizona, across the country? And where are you seeing successes? Where are you seeing heavy pushback?
So we are, as you mentioned, focused not only here in Arizona, but around the country. And so we try to get reforms passed here, and then also, using the system of federalism that says, look, each state is going to get to kind of decide what policies work best for them, to help them try that. So whether it's promoting school choice, educational freedom, ESAs, right, this idea of the funds following a student, also initiatives such as academic transparency that I alluded to, that says we think that parents in any state should be able to see what materials are actually being used to teach their student, right? Whether that's the list of the instructional materials, the lesson plans, whatever it may be. And then also pushing back at the higher education level on a lot of the mandates that tend to be very left-leaning, that compel speech, that prevent student free speech or prevent faculty speech, force, a lot of this CRT, DEI type of content on students. And so we've been working with partners in other states to essentially, help provide some of this not only research and information, but then also looking at model policies. So we put out model legislation, for instance, that helps legislators in any state take this and say, I would like, to implement this idea of educational freedom or academic transparency, or making it so that our faculty don't have to, swear a loyalty oath to CRT or diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to get hired, right? So we put out this content, we work with partners in other states, and we help advance those ideas so that they can take root, across the country. So we do see pushback, essentially in all 50 states where the unions, again, tend to be a dominant force, and they oppose these things rapidly in almost every instance. Something like ESAs, again, it took 10 years to get from, Arizona being the first state in 2011 to now universal education savings account eligibility. So these are very much a process. We've gotten legislation such as campus free speech passed in several states. We've gotten policies even outside of education passed, right, to try various things that get passed at the state level, some of which even get picked up at the federal level. So we've been able to help promote a lot of these ideas, again, with focus on free market principles, and now, in this case of education, to ensure that kids are going to have access to what they need, that parents are going to have access to information, and that our education system doesn't become essentially a political tool of the left to promote a radical agenda.
That's interesting, that last statement you just made, because I don't know a parent out there who doesn't want the political initiatives and all the political stuff really just pulled out of our schools. They've become increasingly weaponized through political ideology that's being just pushed right down into the schools. And whether it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, or any other kind of political focus, when it comes right down to it, what parents and grandparents care about are their children, and they care about their children being taught well, being given those basic foundational concepts that are essential to thriving in today's society. Reading, writing, mathematics, comprehension of history and civics, and all of these things that just, were taken for granted. That was just part of what schools were about, but it doesn't seem that's the case anymore. And so I think, as we focus on these issues, again, it's not a political thing. It's almost an anti-political movement. Everything is politics has gotten into everything and you can't get it out fully. But the classroom should not be a tool of any political agenda to drive that ideology and indoctrination into our students. Is that kind of where you guys are?
That's right. Yeah. And of course, as you said, people are going to have a disagreement about what is political or what is appropriate, but everybody should be able to agree that students should be able to graduate and have an understanding of the mechanisms and the rationale for our system of government, for instance, instead of having a civics class be taught in order to churn out students to go be activists for a particular cause, to take a particular stance on that, right? That's very different. And so I think, as you said, parents want to cover the bases, right? You can even have certain issues that are brought up that may have controversy. You should provide, the ability for those students to tackle those issues and not just be given, sort of talking points from the teachers' unions or from the left, but to be able to wrestle with that. And again, that's where the idea of academic transparency comes in and says, look, we're not going to try to arbitrate everything that you must teach, but you should be open about it so that a parent can see, hey, you're teaching a unit on X. Why does it look like it's all stacked with this sort of resource, right? Instead of saying this is a comprehensive, more honest and full view of history, as opposed to really kind of, a niche left-wing ideological perspective that's being used. So I think you're absolutely right. Parents don't want that. That's why we've seen a lot of parents who have opted for school choice and options outside of the system if they're dissatisfied with that. A lot of families pursuing home education. So we've essentially looked at this and said, look, we think these are two prongs that are related. Having the opportunities to go to a school that's going to serve you better, but also having the information available to help make that choice. And so even states like Arizona, where now we've passed ESAs, we still have parents who, the default, the easiest thing is still to go to your neighborhood school district. But if those school districts aren't forthright about what they're teaching, those parents, may opt into it and say, well, this still seems like it's a perfectly fine option. And then their kids come home with a bunch of content in their backpack, and suddenly they're stuck with this dilemma of, gee, this isn't what I was sort of sold on, but I don't want to pull my kid away from their friends and their established environment. So we've said, look, parents should be able to have this information before they have to make an enrollment decision. They should be able to easily go online and see, well, here's the kind of material that's taught. Is it, again, a bunch of kind of left-wing content, or is it this is good, solid material that's this historically, factually accurate or not? So again, we think that students and parents need the opportunity to go to the schooling environment that's best for them and to be equipped with that information. So we think, again, these are two fights, and we've had national partners such as Heritage who have come out with their Education Freedom Report Card, and they actually rank each state. And two of their main measures are whether or not the families have access to things like ESAs and whether or not they have robust academic transparency or are working toward that.
Yeah, that's important, because if you don't know what the school is delivering or promising, it's kind of like, if you're buying some good at Walmart, for example, there's something there that you can read about it and what it's going to do and what it's not going to do, and then you make your choice whether that's what you need and want before you buy it. And the same thing should be happening in our schools. And so that's a very significant point. Now, I want to ask you a question here, just real quick. I've asked this question to a lot of different people, and I get a pretty consistent answer from people who actually know something about this. But the question that we so often hear, particularly from people that are part of the government school system, and basically are using the talking points of their unions and so forth. And when I say that, I'm not trying to belittle in any way, but that's where we're seeing this point. And that is, every time you take dollars away from your public school, you are ensuring the failure of that public school. Because, every time you take a student out, you're pulling dollars away, and you're finishing off the school. Is that true? Is that something you've seen in Arizona or other places? Or what are you actually seeing?
Well, it's an effective talking point, right? To try and say, hey, look, if you're going to have school choice, it's going to harm other students, or it's going to harm a school. And this idea about, well, the funding isn't going there. What that side tends to want to sweep under the rug is the fact that we have essentially doubled education funding, right? If you look at nationally, even adjusting for inflation, the funding for K-12 schools has dramatically increased over the past several decades.
Yeah.
So it's not that our schools, we always hear about funding cuts, not enough funding for the schools. They are getting dramatically more funding than they did in the past, and yet we're not seeing improvements in the academic achievement, right? So this argument that says, well, you're going to have funding leave a school every year, even this year with universal ESAs in Arizona, the public schools got hundreds of millions of dollars, almost $1 billion of new funding for public schools. So the legislature said, we're going to do both. We're going to allow families to choose where they go, and we're going to give public schools more funding. So yes, you're going to have students who, if they opt out of a school, they'll take their funding with them out of that district and go to an ESA. But that district at the same time is getting millions of dollars plowed into that same school system from taxpayers, right? And so it's pretty disingenuous to argue that they're being destabilized by programs like the ESAs that, again, serve a small fraction of kids. And to somehow argue that this is not something that's sustainable when at the same time their funding every single year goes up, right? And we never hear, well, how much is enough, right? What is the dollar amount that at which point you would finally say, yes, we have the resources that we need. Now we just need to steward them, more effectively. Instead, it's always, we need more funding, and any opportunity to push that narrative, I think is kind of their goal. And so again, it's an effective talking point. It's not what we've seen. Even in Arizona, again, since we passed ESAs, our per pupil funding in Arizona for our public school system, adjusted for inflation, has gone up about $1,600 per student. That's at the same time we've gone from 100 kids in the ESA program to over 10,000 this past year. So, these can exist in parallel, just like the charter schools, right? Every time a kid goes to a charter school, they're not funding a district school. That funding follows the student there. We have a quarter of our kids in charter schools, and yet we've still seen our district schools increase in terms of their per pupil funding. So yes, it does require some management and leadership on the districts to we've seen a lot of poor decisions there about the way that they're spending their resources. And I think that that's part of the conversation about saying, let's make sure that the dollars you are getting actually get into the classroom, get to teachers, and are used for the benefit of students and not for administration and bloat.
Yeah, that's a big point. Absolutely. Well, here's the other side of that. And that's the message I've been hearing consistently from people that are in that space and actually tracking what's going on, is that, you can have it both and it'll work both ways. So it's not really people losing money. Everybody's getting increase. But here's the other side of it. The state schools have the opportunity of getting both the increase and the increase of that student with their enrollment in their school if they will compete effectively for that student. And so really, it's not taking anything away. What it's doing, it's creating more initiative for all school systems and options to compete effectively in the marketplace of students, and those who do well and those who satisfy the customer, they're gonna really do very, very well.
That's right. And we have some areas, even here in Arizona, some school districts where there are almost no charter schools near them because the families are very satisfied with the offerings. It's high performing public district schools. And so there's just not a demand for that. Whereas other parts of the state, even in middle or higher income, and we see these are schools that can't argue that they're underfunded in any meaningful capacity, right? They have plenty of funding when it comes to, we've seen some of the district superintendents even say with the COVID dollars, it's terrifying how much money we have to spend from this flood, this avalanche of COVID funding. And yet there's charter schools and private options all over the place because parents are not satisfied with essentially, ineffective leadership and academic offerings. And so you're absolutely right. These schools, they can get higher funding per student. And if they actually compete, keep those students, and then parents don't have an incentive to look elsewhere if they know that they're going to get a quality, academically enriching education. So I think you're right. It's a lot of talking points from the left. A lot of these are folks who themselves send their kids to private school or to schools of choice. And then when they get called on it as essentially being hypocrites, they say, yeah, but I paid to send my students there. Well, so now they're just making an argument that as long as you have the funding, you should be able to buy your way out of a mediocre public school system, but everybody else should be stuck there. It's just not a particularly compelling message when taxpayers are on the hook to send students to mediocre public schools, if that's all that's being offered. But then left-wing politicians buy their way into a different option. We think that every student, every family should have access to send those dollars to whatever provider it's going to be, whether it's public, private, whatever is going to best suit the needs of that student.
Well, that's great. So where can our listeners learn more?
We have a website, goldwaterinstitute.org. We've got various policy papers on ESAs, academic transparency, a lot of these issues. And so they can visit that and find out more information and hopefully help bring some of these reforms to states across the country.
Excellent. Matt, thank you for taking time to join us today. We appreciate your work, appreciate you joining us, and God bless you.
Thank you very much for having me.